His briefing, and I now give the floor to Ms. Edem Wosornu.
Thank you, Madam President, and thank you to Hans for his update. Whilst Yemen's terrible conflict and associated human suffering has dragged on for over 9 years, we must maintain hope for a political solution. However, people in Yemen are watching with alarm as the crisis spreading across the region brings with it the risk of renewed violence. This is a cause for concern for the people in Yemen and the humanitarian community serving them. In these uncertain times, we are thankful that Julian Hernis has assumed his new role as the Resident and Humanitarian Coordinator for Yemen. He has Under Secretary General Martin Griffiths' full support in fulfilling his essential duties. Further, of course, allow me to thank Peter Hawkins of UNICEF for serving as the Resident and Humanitarian Coordinator ad interim, as well as indeed the previous Resident and Humanitarian Coordinator, David Gressley, for all his work. Madam President, members of the Council, last year, some progress was made in mitigating the humanitarian situation, an indication of the positive impacts of the UN-brokered truce, the subsequent cessation of hostilities, and the humanitarian response. However, the humanitarian appeal for 2024, we and our partners released 2 weeks ago, paints a picture of massive continuing humanitarian needs. For example, in 2024, over 18 million people, that is over half the population of Yemen, will need humanitarian assistance and protection in Yemen, protection services. We anticipate that 17.6 million people will be severely food insecure. An estimated 2.7 million women and children, 5 million children under 5 will need treatment for acute malnutrition. The situation will unfortunately continue to deteriorate without urgent and sufficient attention. Madam President, in 2023, we received just 40% of the total funding needed under the humanitarian plan. We received 1.72 billion of the 4.3 billion US dollars requested. We are truly grateful for donor support and the contributions to the humanitarian response and indeed for the people of Yemen. This year, our response is more targeted and even more prioritized. Our plan has been informed by area-based consultations with local authorities, humanitarian and development actors, and most importantly, the people we serve, the affected people of Yemen. It is better aligned also to some of the development efforts underway. As a result, this year's humanitarian appeal requires 2.7 billion to reach 11.2 million people across Yemen. We've gone down from 4.3 billion ask to $2.7 billion. As a matter of priority, we urge the international community to augment its efforts to ensure that the World Food Programme and its partners have the resources necessary to urgently resume food distribution in Houthi-controlled areas and initiate a retargeted and registration exercise. Without sufficient resources, we may see a sharp deterioration of the food security situation in some areas in the coming months. 2.4 million children and 900,000 women will face an elevated risk of morbidity and mortality due to the malnutrition-related complications. Additionally, in parallel, fully funding the United Nations Development Framework, estimated at $1.3 billion US dollars, should be a priority to see a transition towards more sustainable solutions. Madam President, as we briefed last month, we are watching closely to assess the impacts of the hostilities in the Red Sea on the humanitarian situation and on our humanitarian operations. We are receiving reports that transport costs to Hodeidah and Aden ports have significantly increased since November due to the ongoing hostilities. The World Food Programme has reported increases of up to 110% for containerized shipments to Yemen. Other humanitarian organizations have seen freight rate increase of up to 318%. While the humanitarian community is also concerned about any potential adverse effects of the recent designation of the Houthis as a specially designated global terrorist, we note that general licenses are designed to safeguard many transactions necessary for our humanitarian activities and essential commercial imports. Nevertheless, we fear there may be an effect, of course, on the economy, including commercial imports of essential items on which the people of Yemen, depend on more than ever. Humanitarian aid cannot make up for the gaps in the supply of commercial goods. Such effects may reverberate across the country. Yemen's already fragile economy and economic state cannot handle any further major shocks. In government-held areas, the value of the Yemen rial has deteriorated even further, reaching its lowest point in over 2 years at 1,514 rials against the dollar, eroding more than ever the purchasing power of the average family. We welcome the 30-day delay in implementing the designation, which has enabled consultations within the humanitarian community and the private sector to mitigate its potential impacts. More broadly, humanitarian organizations are putting in place business continuity plans and engaging with a broad set of actors on the ground to, of course, minimize the impact of regional tensions on the humanitarian response and on the people of Yemen. I echo the United Nations Secretary General's call for Security Council Resolution 2722 to be respected in its entirety and the need to avoid acts that could further worsen the situation in Yemen. Madam President, distinguished members of the Council, as the possibility of a return to conflict and increased humanitarian needs grow, we must remember that Yemen is at the forefront of yet another crisis, the global climate crisis. It is the third most vulnerable country in the world to climate change and one of the least prepared for climate shocks. By 2060, the United Nations Development Programme predicts that extreme poverty could be more than 25% higher than it otherwise would be due to climate change. Climate-induced natural hazards are also already worsening the impacts of the annual rainy season, droughts, water scarcity, and desert locusts. Last year, heavy rains and flooding affected around 580,000 people and caused a reported 2,381 injuries and 47 deaths. Climate-related emergencies not only compound pre-existing risks, but also drive new needs. Over 3/4 of the people newly displaced in Yemen last year were displaced because of severe weather events. Climate change emergencies accelerate the humanitarian crisis by driving displacement and increasing protection concerns. They threaten the lives and livelihoods and well-being of households. The impact on girls and women who have more limited access to essential services and protection services can be particularly severe. However, Yemen will need much more international support to prepare for and mitigate the worst impact of the climate crisis. This includes adequate access to climate financing, assistance with streamlining national preparatory systems, and investment in climate-resilient development activities and initiatives. Madam President, let me end with 3 points. 2024 can still be the year Yemen turns the page on the tragedy and suffering stemming from years of conflict and economic deterioration. Second, we urge the Council to offer its full support to the humanitarian community in its ability to respond to the urgent crisis being experienced, help the people of Yemen transition towards self-sufficiency. And lastly, we further ask Council members to urge all involved to choose the path of de-escalation and peace. I thank you.
Ms. Wosornu for her briefing, and I